All right, everybody. I think we're pretty much all here, something like that. I wanted to, it always helps if I turn everything on so you can see it. What a great morning to start a class, right? Um, at this point, we now have a web page, a Canvas page. So it's going to be a little bit different than what you had earlier. If you were enrolled in Geography 3093, then you had one Canvas site, and then if you were in the history version, you had a different Canvas site. And what we've done as of last night, ITLE combined those two sections into a new section, and then they copied all my stuff over to this new one. It's called Geog-Hist 3093. And so if I click in that, you'll be able to see what we want to see. And this is a very large resolution compared to my computer. And the other thing I have to mention to you, even though I'm going to be showing PowerPoints a lot in here, um, um, the computer is feeding through a VGA connection, and VGA will um, have a little bit of a seizure every now and then. So if it flickers up there, don't worry, it'll come back. So anyway, just to warn you there. And anyway, if you look at the course page now, the, uh, you'll see if you may have seen that picture somewhere before, right? So this little picture is the same as the textbook, so you'll know what to look for. It has just some landscape pictures on there. If you were to click onto that, the syllabus is up and running, so everything's good on the syllabus. Today, and I covered most of this on Tuesday, but go through and you can now read through it, and then the reading assignments are listed, but those are not linked yet. So you're still waiting on some readings from me. Sorry about that. You can go ahead and read Nostrand's stuff. And for Nostrand today, you should have read, but probably haven't even gotten the book yet. That's fine. Pages 17 through 31 in the Nostrand book, which is right here, the Spanish Borderlands. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so we're going to cover the Spanish Borderlands, and then we'll move on as rapidly as we possibly can. So that's that. The Spanish Borderlands. Y'all have any questions before we get started about the text or any other readings? Okay, I did tell you the other day that there are some other readings, and there are some other readings, and I did bring some actual copies of the books. And I told you about one that was by well, it was like it's from Stillwater Middle School, no kidding. Okay, and it was I bought it at a book sale somewhere. But anyway, that's this is called The Discovery of North America. It's like a seventh grade book. But if you are from China and you have no clue about American history, this is just kind of, I put this in there because it's kind of a quick primer, or if maybe it's been a while since you've had any history courses, you can read through that stuff very, very quickly. It's just kind of the bare bones stuff. All right, so that's going to be there. And then I have one of the first readings is one of the lectures by Harlan Barrows, and it's out of this old book. And Barrows is one of the first things you'll read is Eastern North America as a fur trader's country. I think I mentioned that to you. So you'll see that, and of course that's a little bit different than the other book. And then this book, which is your textbook. See, I told you. The textbook. I'm not really concerned that you read the overview and stuff at this point. I want you to go ahead and jump straight into the substantive chapters. So I'd like for you to go ahead and start reading on page 17, and it looks just like that. Okay. Now I told you a little bit about this book. It's not the most attractive book. There are lots of historical geography texts out there, U.S. historical, North American historical, but this is the only one that is intentionally made very simple. And that's what makes it such a great tool in the classroom, okay? So if you would, just go ahead and we'll get started with that. Let's see if I can get this PowerPoint thing to work, and we'll get the lights dim. Ah, there we go. Can everybody see that? Let me see that here. Okay. Let me get the lights. And here we go. So the Spanish Borderlands, and tell me if that's a little bit, is that a little bit blurry to you all? No? Maybe it's just me. I think we need to do something. Would you mind if I stand in your seat right there? That's the only way I can do this. But this will drive me nuts if it's not focused. So, sorry. Okay. I thought it was focused earlier, but maybe. Oh. Is that better? No. That's good? All right. Okay. Thanks so much. Sorry about that. How's it going? All right. So the Spanish Borderlands. Now, if anybody's had a chance to read the Nostrand text, whenever we cover, the Spanish period, there are some generalizations. So be looking for those generalizations about the Spanish by the end of the class. Nostrand begins with a little bit of a discussion on theory. Oh my goodness. This is historical geography. We're not supposed to have theory, right? In fact, there's a little bit, not much, but just a little bit. And the idea here is by a cultural geographer by the name of Wilbur Zelinsky. And in 1974, Zelinsky wrote a nice little short book called The Cultural Geography of the United States. And in that little book, he had some pretty interesting points. And one of those has been labeled the Doctrine of First Effective Settlement. He called it the Doctrine of First Effective Settlement. Basically, it's just an idea, all right? And this idea is based in the experience of, of North America. It goes something like this. Whenever an empty territory, well, okay, we know it wasn't an empty territory, right? But an empty territory undergoes settlement, or an earlier population is dislodged by invaders. That happened. The specific characteristics of the first group able to effect a viable, self-perpetuating society are of crucial significance for the later social and cultural geography of the area, no matter how tiny the initial band of settlers may have been. Okay? No matter how tiny the initial band of settlers may have been. In other words, what happens is that that first group of people pretty much set the stage for other processes that take place, and that early set of people or group of people kind of set the tone and the direction of things if they're permanent and if they are in a viable colony. In terms of lasting impact, the activities of a few hundred or even a few score initial colonizers can mean much more for the cultural geography of a place than the contributions of tens of thousands of new immigrants a few generations later. So people tend to follow the leader. They tend to do what the natives do, or at least do what the Romans do. And so this is just an idea. I'm not saying this is the gospel or anything like that. It's just one of those ideas that you run into in a course like this. So be thinking about that, whether or not you buy it or not. The Spanish Borderlands term comes to us mainly from a historian of the U.S.-Mexico borderland, and Herbert Eugene Bolton, who had a lot of interaction with it's the VGA thing. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. But anyway, the Borderlands concept is in some ways, and Nostrand notes this, kind of an anachronism in that the border between the United States and Mexico is itself has always been a zone where there's some commonality. So, in fact, the northern part of Mexico and the southwestern part of the United States have a lot more in common than the northern part of Mexico does with southern Mexico, or the Southwest does with the rest of the United States West. Okay, so the idea is that the border has perhaps divided a fairly functional region that existed prior to the expansion of the United States and the establishment of that border in the 1840s. So it's always been a region of some distinction, some uniqueness. The U.S. Southwest and the northern part of Mexico. But we're not really so concerned about regionalization as much as we are process. And so, in terms of Spanish colonization, this was one of the very earliest parts of the United States that was successfully colonized by the Spanish. And the Spanish weren't successful everywhere in North America, and particularly they weren't successful in establishing viable colonies east of the Mississippi River. But they were west of the Mississippi River, and that's something that we want to keep in mind. Now, to understand the Spanish colonization of the Southwest, we really ought to recognize the early movement of the Spanish into the Caribbean. And for that matter, the early part of North America's historical geography is very much connected to the Caribbean in many ways, and by many groups, not just the Spanish. So the very first European entry for the long term and the long haul into North America, and I gave recognition of the Norse, of the Vikings, but the fact of the matter is, even if the Norse got all the way to Heavener, Oklahoma, anybody ever been to Heavener? What's at Heavener that has anything to do with the Vikings? The rune stone, yeah, exactly. Some farmer, supposedly came across this big chunk of sandstone. If you've ever been to it, it's actually a beautiful place. It's a waterfall and everything. The idea was that perhaps some Norse explorers stopped through there and left some markings on some rocks. There are other areas, other runes, other evidence of that in places like northern Minnesota. But it's a little suspect in or in central Minnesota, because central Minnesota was colonized by a lot of Scandinavians, and they might want to, may have been a hoax. I don't know. Most people kind of think that's generally a hoax. I wouldn't say necessarily disbelieve it, but point of the matter is, we don't know that the Vikings or the Norse from Denmark and Scandinavia eventually had much of an impact on the population. Perhaps they lasted for a few generations and basically melded into the general native Indian population, Native American population. That's a possibility. But the Spanish were here to stay, and they're very intentional. And you had rather than small, tiny groups of Norse, you had an empire. And of course, 1492 for us is very significant, because all school children are taught that 1492 is this very significant year in which the Europeans, we say the Spanish, or we might even say the Portuguese, because remember, Columbus was sailing for Spain, but he was a citizen of Portugal because he was married to a Portuguese woman. But he was originally from Genoa. He was originally from Italy. He was an Italian navigator. So he was kind of a global guy. And so Columbus, anyway, is funded by the Spanish crown. You ever think about that? It was really a woman who made the decision. It was a woman who made the decision. It was Queen Isabella of Spain who financed Columbus, who, he sweet-talked her into this. And she made the decision. Any other, most mariners had absolutely no reason to attempt what Columbus did. And had Columbus had good information, he wouldn't have done it either, right? You know that it's not so much that people thought the world was flat; they thought the world was much smaller than it really is. Okay, and so that size of the Earth was the mistake that led to this happenstance discovery of a couple of new continents. Anyway, the Spanish figured out after about 30 or 40 years that this was not just a bunch of little islands. This was a new world. And anyway, the sequence of occupants, the sequence of occupancy in the Caribbean begins with the island, for the most part, and island of Hispaniola, or Hispaniola as it's spelled today. It's just the island where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located. And this was Saint Domingue, or Santo Domingo, was the very first Spanish outpost there, and the first sort of, in a sense, capital or sort of base of operations for the Spanish. And the Spanish quickly moved on to Cuba, and so Havana became a very, very important point in the exploration of the Caribbean, and particularly the connection to Mexico, because of course in 1515, that's 2 years before Cortez arrives into Mexico. All right, and by 1519, Cortez has essentially conquered the Aztec Empire, and the Spanish begin to establish themselves in Mexico City. Mexico City becomes the capital of New Spain, and the capital of the viceroyalty of this colonial world for the Spanish, and would stay that way until Spain was evicted from the continent, or at least evicted from Mexico in 1821. So the borderland region is, of course, today very much an area where there's a combination of Anglo-American traits and Hispanic and Amerindian traits. So, and in addition to the Anglos, there is quite a number of, this is an area that has some French connections, and we'll talk about the French next week. Now, in terms of land and geography and land tenure, there's some really important facets of the Spanish approach, Spanish colonization effort. I guess I got to go back. I was talking about 1492, and I completely forgot what I was trying to tell you. Sorry. And 1492 is this very significant year that we even celebrate, right? It's becoming less and less popular to celebrate Columbus Day, but the 1492 was also a significant year within Spain itself, without even considering the New World. What was so significant about 1492 to Spain? It was the final year, yeah, it was the eviction of the Moors, the end of what the Spanish had been referring to as the Reconquest or Reconquista. And so the reconquest of Spain from the Muslim occupiers who had been there since the 8th century. And so the Muslims, or the North African Berber and Arab people referred to as the Moors, who had expanded the Islamic reach into southern Spain, into most of Spain, at least the southern 2/3 or so. They were eventually evicted, eventually conquered, and run across the Straits of Gibraltar. So the Reconquest had a lot more significance in 1492 for Spain than Columbus's voyage, and would continue to be for a long time. Now, the Reconquest itself was the sort of the climax or the culmination of centuries, literally centuries of a Spanish military heritage. The Spanish, of course, had inherited their organizational skills and their military prowess largely from the Romans. They continued this on, and by 1492, they're maybe we can get ITLE to give us some new equipment. We'll see about that. Uh, anyway, by 1492, we have this pushing out and this need to expand, and Spain would eventually wind up having a great deal of development, or at least a great deal of wealth discovered in the New World. As I'm sure we don't really need to talk too much about not just Cortez discovering the gold and the wealth of the Aztec Empire, but later Pizarro down in Peru and the Andes, and the conquest of the Inca a little bit later. All of that led to a massive run on the native peoples, and so the Spanish had the early the earliest shot at conquest and basically robbing native empires, taking over native empires. The Portuguese, of course, tried to follow up, following their lead, but because of the boundary established by the Pope in 1494, the Portuguese were not allowed to go any farther west. Of course, they were mostly fixated on Africa and Southeast Asia anyway. So the Portuguese are sort of redirected by the line of the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. Tordesillas. This was the treaty that was essentially established by the Pope, and it was a boundary between the holdings that Spain could claim to the west of the line, and the holdings that the Portuguese could claim in the world to the east of the line. And the line was a line of longitude that crossed through the eastern part of South America. So at the time, the Portuguese thought they were getting a really good deal, because the Pope was actually in with the Portuguese and intended to give the Portuguese the favor. But in 1494, nobody knew enough about what existed west of the line. So the Spanish wound up getting it fortuitously, and eventually were able to develop this land empire. Anyway, the land claims and the land tenure system that the Spanish put in place all over the continent followed the laws of the Indies. And this was something that was established, of course, a bit later, 1573. This was a centralized plan, for the most part, put out by the Spanish in conjunction with the church, that the colonization of the New World would follow along certain objectives. And those objectives would be to conquer and to Christianize and to establish some degree of civil communities. And so the various terms that you'll run into are the presidio. The presidio refers to essentially a fortress, or at least a place where military, where soldiers and military commanders could coordinate defense and also offensive moves against native peoples. There are four presidios eventually established in California. You've probably maybe visited, if you've ever visited San Francisco, you may have visited the Presidio. It's a big tourist attraction. There's also a movie, I think, with Sean Connery, I think. Anyway, the Presidios, and we'll see a map of them later, were few in number. There were a few along the Gulf Coast in Texas, and they're a very important one that we'll talk about in just a little bit. And then there were missions. The missions were the church focus. They were the places where, sort of like monasteries, they were places where the Roman Catholic Church often assigned certain monastic orders, such as the Franciscans or the Jesuits, and they had the job of civilizing, of Christianizing, converting native people. So we tend to find missions established wherever there are significant pockets of native peoples, and that would be in places like California, southern Arizona, of course the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico, and a few other places, also in places like Nacogdoches, Texas, and of course Florida. So in terms of the civil communities, they went by different names. It doesn't really matter. We don't need to worry about those too much. Just keep in mind that there's a civil community type thing. Los Angeles, for example, was established as a Spanish civil community in the 1700s, mid-1700s. So land use types. Nostrand will mention these in your readings. Basically, you might run into in the communal areas or in the civil communities, you had farms, so suertes, and then the communal lands in the mission areas, ejidos, and dehesas for pastures and ranches. But this is the slide probably that you should really pay attention to. This has the primary types of land tenure systems that were implemented by the Spanish in North America. Now, the one that you've probably heard about before is the encomienda system. The encomienda system was established in New Spain in Mexico much earlier than it was ever established in North America. And the encomienda system was generally a way for lands for the crown, the government of Spain, the crown of Spain, to dole out rewards of land to retired military men for the most part. Okay, so the way for upward mobility within Spain during the late Middle Ages was generally through the military. Okay, if you weren't fortunate enough to be born into an aristocratic family, you could make your way into the upper classes, or at least get close to the upper classes through military experience and military success. So commanders in the Spanish military were often rewarded after their careers were over by receiving large land grants that were generally referred to as encomiendas, and so these retired generals and so forth were referred to as encomenderos. So they, for the most part, were receiving a grant of land, but they were also receiving a grant of Indian labor. That's the key. The encomienda system was a grant of land, but it was also it gave the encomendero the rights to coerce any native inhabitants within that region as basically peasants or serfs. We probably could say slaves, but in a sense they were allowed to have their own farms, their own ways of making, of raising food and that sort of thing. But they were obligated to the Spanish. So in a sense, the Spanish were transferring, and this is an important generalization, the Spanish fairly successfully transferred a feudal system from Southern Europe, Spanish feudalism, into the New World, into Mexico, into New Spain. It was intentional, and it worked for a while. They got in trouble with the church. The mistreatment of native peoples was something that the Roman Catholic Church did somewhat police the the political classes with. So eventually, the encomienda system was actually never very successful within the area that we call the United States today. It was largely abandoned by the time significant settlement arrived into the northern part of the Rio Grande Valley. Another type, though, the rest of these were actually utilized. So the encomienda system mostly stays in Mexico. The only place that it was implemented was in the Santa Fe, Taos area, and the Pueblo Indians revolted against the Spanish, largely because of that. So the other types are the hacienda or estancia. These are basically land grants to the aristocracy, to the military retirees, and we find those in New Mexico today. And other ranches are were just private land grants, largely in areas that are semi-arid, outside of good farmlands like the haciendas. But these are primarily areas in Southern California and in Texas, where for the most part these gentlemen retirees would raise cattle. That was, raising cattle in Mexico or in New Spain was always something that the wealthy aristocracy did. Cattle raising was just part of the culture. It was part of the Spanish culture and very much part of the Caribbean culture. The last of the land tenure systems that I want you to pay attention to is actually a very late one, and in fact is really not that relevant to the class here, because we stop at about 1800. So this is kind of a plug for the next class, So the impresario system, and the impresario system is basically the system that early Texas was settled under. The impresario system is a land grant from the crown or from the government, because Mexico, of course, Mexico inherited the system from the Spanish after the Mexican Revolution, and continued this. But the land grants would be given over to individuals, and those individuals, people like initially Moses Austin, but he died, and his son took over, Stephen F. Austin, and Stephen F. Austin was the one who, he was the one that actually brought people into the first Austin colony. But there are a lot of other colonies around South Central Texas. So the core area of early Anglo Texas was an area of impresario grants. And those impresarios, the key about the impresario is that the proprietor, the impresario individual, had an obligation to bring in so many settlers over such and such period, and the settlers then would provide a population that would essentially provide political stability. That was the idea. So the point here is that in Texas, settlement, all of these systems had some commonalities. They were largely inheriting the old Southern European, Roman, Hispano system of conquest and establishing a feudalistic order, feudalistic economy, with the intent of the aristocracy gaining from this system. And none of them were very successful at all. And if where they were successful, about the only place where you do find some significant success in Spanish settlement is in New Mexico. The rest of these were largely unimpressive. Okay, so with the exception of Texas, and that's because the impresarios asked the wrong people to settle. Actually, they asked the right people to settle. They asked Southern Anglo cotton producers and ranchers who came out of the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee, especially Tennessee, into Texas. in the early 1820s and 1830s. And the Anglos colonized Texas at the request of originally the Spanish and then Mexico, but it backfired on them. Okay, so anyway, we'll save that for next semester, and we'll move on. The most important fortress within the Spanish Caribbean, or at least this area that we're concerned with, is St. Augustine, and that's the sort of the hub of what we can call Spanish Florida. Now, Spanish Florida has this long period of 1565 all the way into the 19th century. In Florida, everybody wants to be in Florida today, right? Anybody want to move to Florida after you graduate? Oh, well, you're a sensible bunch, because half of my family, all of my family have lived in Florida. Still, some of them do, but most of them have left. Okay, so anyway, I don't recommend Florida. Now, 50 years ago, everybody wanted to move to Florida, right? And that's why we don't want to go back there. So 50 years ago, everybody was moving to Florida, right? Why? Well, it's a nice place. They got great beaches, and it's a wonderful, beautiful place. It's nice and warm. Of course, with air conditioning kind of made all the difference in Florida. And that was mostly a post-World War II thing. Before World War II, and especially before World War I, Florida was ranch country. It was not a really highly populated area. Well, there were some, around the orange groves along the East Coast. But if you go back to the 19th century and early 19th century, Florida was a lot like the southwestern desert borderlands. It was not just a harsh environment that people generally didn't want to go to. It was a dangerous place. Why did the Spanish consider the north, what we call today northern Mexico and the southwestern United States, why did the Spanish even bother to establish presidios and pueblos and missions in that region? This was an area that was problematic to the Spanish forever. The northern part of Mexico, it's still problematic for them, all right, for the Mexican government. But northern Mexico was the realm of the Apaches, the Comanches, a little farther north, the Navajos, various other groups who were largely hostile to Spanish intrusion. And so northern Mexico was a wild and woolly frontier for the Spanish. They did their best to establish themselves, but they were never very successful and never very diligent about establishing long-term colonies, except in the upper Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico. And that's largely because that was an area of a different group of native peoples, the Pueblos. The Pueblos, as their name implies, were essentially civil people. They lived in communities. They lived in large apartment dwellings, and they were agriculturalists. They were not necessarily nomadic. They farmed corn. They produced a surplus, and the Spanish, of course, colonized their area, colonized their good farmland in the Rio Grande Valley. In the early 1700s, in the mid 1700s, is when most of the Spanish colonists moved north into the upper Rio Grande Valley, into what is today, central and northern New Mexico. And those folks over in central and northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, still refer to themselves as Spanish Americans. They make a strong distinction between themselves and Mexicans or Chicanos or Latinos or whatever. And so those Spanish Americans or Hispanos trace their ancestry back to the 18th century, to the colonists who came generally from southern Mexico, but they were generally a European stock. They were not so much mestizos. So today in northern New Mexico, you have this sort of antiquated version of Spanish, a lot of archaic terms and names that are no longer very common in the rest of the Spanish-speaking world. All right, so anyway, let's go back to Spanish Florida. Why did the Spanish establish a place in Florida? It has to do with geopolitics. All right, geopolitics were driving the Spanish around North America. They were primarily concerned, of course, with the Caribbean islands. The Caribbean islands were producing sugar, and sugar was, in large part, the money-making drug of the 16th century. All right, so the Spanish were protecting the sugar colonies, but they were also protecting the gold shipments that were coming out of not just Mexico, but by the mid 1500s out of South America. Okay, so let me zip over to a map, if you don't mind, and just to give you an idea. Okay, thank you very much. Come on. All right. So see, it's a seizure. It's a seizure. So anyway, we have just to see some, and this is kind of a neat old, funny looking map. But the thing you need to remember, okay, here's Cuba, right? And there's Havana, and here is Española. Okay, so Santo Domingo's up here, and then of course Cortez arrives, Veracruz, and then conquers the Valley of Mexico right around here. So where is the gold coming from? The gold is coming from the Valley of Mexico, and everything in the Spanish system is very centralized. So just like the Romans, the Spanish ship everything out of Veracruz. So Veracruz is the port, and from Veracruz is where all of the Spanish galleons, these big, heavy, gold and silver laden ships, are moving the capital, in a sense, the capital, the money from the Aztec Empire back to Spain. All right, so they're leaving Veracruz, and the way that you get back, because of the currents and the wind patterns. Now, if you realize in this part of the world, in the subtropical area, you've got some things going on. In this area, as you get closer to the equator and down here near the Tropic of Cancer, you've got high pressure, you've got lower winds. A little bit farther south, you've got the easterlies. So the easterly winds, or tropical easterlies, are very constant. They're always reliable, and this is what the Spanish used in order to get to the New World. They would tack south. They would go south along the African coast down to the Canary Islands or so. They would latch onto the trade winds. The trade winds would zip them across the Atlantic. They would come in, and you notice the arrows coming in to the Caribbean. They would come in along what? The Windward Islands. So the Windward Islands were over here. They would come in through this way, and then sailing ships would go to these different ports. Now, as you know, South America is down here. The Andes are right about here. We've got the Inca Empire, which is being conquered by Spain also, Pizarro and his cronies. And those people are moving gold and silver to Veracruz. And the way that they have to get there is they ship it out of places like Lima, right? And Lima, Peru. They ship it out, and then they have to cross over the Isthmus of Panama, the shortest route. So there's kind of a base at Panama, but everything still goes to Veracruz first. So it's a route that pretty much is concentrated. And so the gold shipments are coming out of Veracruz. They catch the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is this warm water, very strong current that can be used for navigation. And so out of Veracruz, they take the Gulf Stream up through the Straits of Florida, between Cuba and Florida, real dangerous area right through here. They go up the coast of Florida, up to about the outer banks of North Carolina, and then the Gulf Stream continues across the Atlantic where it becomes the North Atlantic Drift. And as you probably know, the North Atlantic Drift, the Gulf Stream, keeps northern Europe very temperate, very warm, not warm, but it keeps it from getting really, really cold, really far north. But the Gulf Stream is for the most part, the way that the Spanish can get far enough north out of the horse latitudes so that they can catch the westerlies. And the westerlies are the stormy systems that we live in here in Oklahoma. So you have, for the most part, the general movement of weather systems is from west to east. So the winds aren't as reliable, but they are reliable enough. So they would take these westerly winds to get back to Spain. So essentially the loop looks something like this: from Spain down to Africa, across the Atlantic, and then to get back, you got to go back north. You go back north and then cross like this. So the choke point, the geographic choke point, is right here in the Straits of Florida. That's the dangerous place. Not just because of reefs, not just because of storms and hurricanes, but because of the English. The English. All right? So let's zip back a little bit here. Spanish Florida gets established 1565. The fortress is built about 1570. So at any one time, at most, there are only about 3,000 to 4,000 Spaniards living in Spanish Florida. Now, certainly by the time Andrew Jackson marched down, in the early 1800s, it was pretty much a total backwater. But during the 1700s, during the period of prior to the American Revolutionary War, it was still very much held by the Spanish. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of show you the sequence of holdings. Now, if you're a history major, this is probably old stuff. Sorry, but this is the way it went. Spain, of course, lost Florida to England after the end of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. England kicked the French off the continent and pretty much took things from the Spanish too. So Spain loses Florida to England in 1763, and then of course the British never go to Florida. They're not so interested in it at all. It's a backwater. It's a place where the native peoples were allied more with the Spaniards than the English. So it was essentially neglected for 20 years of the developing American sort of independence attitudes. And by the time the Americans overthrow their colonial masters, Florida winds up going back to Spain. So Florida is returned to Spain in 1783, and the Spanish actually come back and reoccupy St. Augustine for a little while. But of course, it was a half-hearted effort, and so by 1819, after Jackson expands his influence, and militarily, Florida is for the most part transferred over to the United States. It would still remain a backwater of mostly cattle ranching until the middle part of the 1800s, late part of the 1800s. St. Augustine. How many of you have visited St. Augustine? Yeah, it's been a while since I was there, but I was able to go around. The photographs I'm going to show you today are from the Historic American Building Survey, the HABS survey, if some of you have heard of that. And so these are really old pictures from like 1936 or so. So they're like 85 years old or so. So anyway, you have a fortress. This is a real common shape, with the moat around it. And of course, this has been largely restored. This is the interior of it, and of the interior part of the Castillo, with the castellations there and so forth. All right, so let's talk about that area where the Spanish were fairly successful within North America. New Mexico. Okay, New Mexico. Now, by the way, all of this is going to be going up on online. If you're new to the class, I guess I should have mentioned that. If you're new to the class, I put this stuff up for you, so don't feel really obligated to photograph it necessarily, or even if you don't feel like taking notes. You might take notes on the important stuff, but you certainly don't have to go berserk with the notes at this point. Okay, so we've got about I guess 15, 20, 25 minutes left. So I want to cover definitely New Mexico and as much as we can. So what attracted, as I mentioned earlier, the Spanish were attracted to the north primarily for geopolitical reasons. They wanted to, stabilize that frontier. They wanted a stable frontier. They were never very successful at getting large numbers of people, except for a few places, and that primarily is the Upper Rio Grande Valley. There was some exploration that took place and actually crossed through a little bit of Oklahoma. If you've ever visited the Panhandle of Oklahoma, Cimarron County, my favorite county in the state, and the attempt to find wealth, right, is what attracted Coronado up into what is basically now central Kansas, about as far as central Kansas. We're not really sure exactly how far he went, but if you've ever been to Lindsborg, Kansas, anybody ever been to Lindsborg? You know where Little Sweden is? Really? Okay, cool. So you've been to like Coronado Heights, that big sandstone thing? Yeah. So it's that was actually built in the 1930s by like the WPA or something, but it's that's considered the probably the farthest north point. And so the Coronado was looking for the 7 cities of Cibola, right? The 7 cities of gold, and this was one of those legends, right? So you're going to read this little thing. You may have seen it on the syllabus, called by Ralph Brown, called Geography Fancies, basically fantasies. There are a lot of geographical fantasies that actually have some importance because they suckered a lot of people into doing some crazy things, like sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. All right. So bad information sometimes is very important in getting things going. And one of those was the entradas that the Spanish conquistadors from Mexico would do. They would go into these areas, and they had armies with them. They had mules, they had oxen, they had livestock, they had slaves, they had lots of Indian slaves. They had lots of weaponry, and they marched into the Great Plains, one of my favorite regions. And just like Napoleon marching into Russia, the Spanish marched into the Great Plains and couldn't find anything, and they just got worn out and sick and tired and mutinous and turned around. They never found what they were looking for. They were following up on rumors that there was a great empire in the interior. You can imagine those, the army comes through, the Indians say, oh yeah, we're not the people you're looking for. You're looking for those people way up north. Just keep on going. Just keep on going, right? So they went all the way up into central Kansas, and then by the time they got to Lindsborg, they said, nothing up here, let's go home. But there's actually a lot of better stories like that, like Cabeza de Vaca, right? Remember him? You can read about him. Well, anyway, up in New Mexico, the region that the Spanish were successful in was, for the most part, the upriver country, the Rio Arriba, and I hope I said that correctly. Anyway, the upriver country, which receives a little bit more rainfall, a little more certainly temperate and nicer in terms of climate than the lower elevation areas, the Rio Abajo. So the downriver country was important for growing cotton and that sort of thing because you had longer growing seasons, but this is where most of the people are concentrated, in the higher country. And again, I mentioned the Pueblo Indians. The Pueblos were the folks who were initially targeted by the Entrada in 1598. The Spanish were looking for a sedentary group of people, people who we could make into agricultural peasants, into serfs, and establish that feudal system. And of course, their excuse was, well, we need to convert them to Christianity, to the true religion anyway. And in time, the economy was focused on producing food crops, corn, beans, squash, as well as producing some textiles, woolen textiles. And the encomienda system was the system that was established. But in 1608, the Pueblos revolted, and sent the Spanish south down to El Paso. All right, El Paso was their refuge, and they regrouped after a few years and returned to Santa Fe, established Santa Fe in 1610. What am I? I'm saying this the wrong way. 1680 was the Pueblo Revolt. So Santa Fe is established 1610. 1680 is the Pueblo's Revolt. They go back to El Paso. They hang out for a little while, and then they return and conquer the Pueblos. Right around 1695, I guess. So anyway, this is one facet of the culture of New Mexico. Is these folks who are descended from the people who the Spanish enslaved, largely Comanches, largely Comanche Indians in southern New Mexico and eastern New Mexico. So anyway, the Hispano peoples of northern New Mexico have a heritage that's Spanish, that's to some degree Native American. Some architectural features of the region, right? This is again from the Habs survey at Zuni Pueblo. Oh, look at that. See if I can change slides in between the flash. Some other just shots of Pueblo life back in the 1930s. Probably what they looked like before tourism and casinos, right? So this is what probably the folks like John Collier and anthropologists saw in the 1930s. What's that? What do you think that would be? An oven, yeah, an oven, a bread oven, baking bread. Excellent. Ladders, because you enter the house from the roof, right? Interesting stuff. The old native Pueblo architectural features that are now copied in, or at least copied back in the 1920s, 1930s. Here's a Coma Pueblo from the air. It's up on a mesa. Defensible site, really cool. Another shot of a Coma Pueblo. Churches also, wherever the mission is largely identified by the presence of an old Catholic church. Okay. So peripheral areas. The core area for New Mexico is the Rio Grande Valley, Upper Rio Grande Valley in particular, but there are other areas that the Spanish established, and these are sort of the minor areas that and Nostrand will cover this in your reading. The Pimería Alta was the land of the Pima Indians, and this was largely along the Gila River Valley in southern Arizona today, and this was an area that was attractive to the Jesuits. The Jesuits arrived there and established their mission operations. And like the Pueblos back in 1680, the Pimas eventually got tired of them and revolted. The Jesuits were actually kicked out of North America. If you know your Catholic history, the Jesuits were actually removed, and then the Franciscans, for the most part, replaced them in places like southern Arizona and also in California. So here are some other photos of the region and around Tucson, Arizona, San Xavier del Bac, and desert environments. So why is it that the Spanish did pretty good in the dry environments of the Southwest and the highland environments of Mexico, but they didn't do so hot in Florida, and they didn't do so great in Texas or Louisiana? Trafficability.
It's easier to go across country in a dry land than it is in a swamp.
Okay, all right.
What do you guys find similar to the dry?
Yeah, I think that's the explanation that people like Herbert Eugene Bolton always said was that, the Meseta, the highlands of the Iberian Peninsula, were a lot closer in environmental, characteristics to the Southwest, and especially to highland Mexico, than than the southeastern United States. We've got lots and lots of rain, and where you couldn't grow the same kinds of crops, that sort of thing. So, and the other thing we should mention is that wherever the Spanish settled, and the Roman Catholic Church settled, they needed to grow some wine. They needed to grow some grapes, right? They were looking for that Mediterranean sort of crop. They were, but there was never much of an economic impetus for the colonization of any of the Spanish areas in what is today the United States, with the exception of subsistence farming in the Rio Grande Valley. The farmers who came up from Mexico, the more or less poor Spaniards from eastern Mexico, who migrated up to the area around Santa Fe, they were not wealthy folks. They were not aristocratic at all. They were families, and they established themselves. They never got rich. They produced, food crops, subsistence crops. They had some livestock. The only time they ever were really very significant was in the days of the Santa Fe Trail trade between Missouri, for the most part Independence, Missouri, and Santa Fe. And they were involved with that trade largely because they could produce textiles, and they bred mules that were in demand back in the United States. So they were never rich, but they were successful in terms of establishing themselves as families. And for the most part, the church, the centralized authority of the Spanish crown, the military, all of those command and control imperial efforts to establish footholds on the continent of North America were not very successful at all. They were largely unsuccessful because they never were able to attract civilian colonists. That's it. They were never very successful at attracting civilian colonists. They were pretty good at converting native peoples over to Catholicism. But then Catholicism is a religion that is really good at incorporating local practices and not worrying too much about changing the way people do things. Okay, as long as you get the liturgy right, you can still maybe go back behind the church and worship the sun god. Just don't let anybody know, right? So it's that's the way it works. But in North America, all of those areas that were colonized by the Spanish, and I'm going to zip through here, particularly in the more humid parts of North America, never very successful at all. So let's look at some of those examples. In the time we have remaining, the attraction of the Spanish into the area of Louisiana and Texas, into the Red River country, the lower part of the Red River, the thing that really attracted the Spanish there was only politics for the most part. The only reason the Spanish arrived late was because the French had a strong presence in South Louisiana by the early 1700s. So the fort that was established in northwestern Louisiana, you know where Toledo Bend Lake is along the Louisiana-Texas border? Okay, the Toledo Bend Lake dammed up the Sabine River, right? So you know where the Sabine is? So the Sabine River was an important boundary zone, sort of. But if you go west of the north part of Toledo Bend, into northwest Louisiana, then there's a town there referred to as Natchitoches. Okay. When it comes basketball season, you'll know about Natchitoches because Northwestern State University of Louisiana plays basketball against us every now and then. Okay, Northwestern State. So they're in Natchitoches, Louisiana. Well, the Spanish, I mean, the French established a fort at Natchitoches, Louisiana. It's pronounced exactly like the way it's spelled, Natchitoches. How do you think you spell that? Natchitoches. No, it doesn't look anything like Natchitoches. But anyway, it looks like Natchitoches, all right? But it's Natchitoches. Anyway, the French got there in 1714. Natchitoches is the oldest continuously occupied settlement in the Louisiana Purchase region, 1714. The Spanish heard about it. So the Spanish arrive and establish a fort about 4 miles away, literally 4 miles away from Natchitoches, and they call it Los Adias. So this was the early fort, 5 miles, about 15 miles west. Okay, I used to live there, so I kind of know that. Now this established Los Adias is the very first capital of Texas. Okay, now this province of New Spain that became known as Tejas, right, was considered just a northern frontier backwater. But this was the idea was that if they established themselves along the French colonization line, then the French wouldn't continue south. They were for the most part establishing geopolitical footholds in order to check the expansion of the French. Okay? So the Spanish were attracted to Texas initially, in Louisiana initially, because they were just playing political chess, geopolitical chess with the French. Okay? Everybody beats the French at geopolitical chess, but not the Spanish. Okay. Anyway, so here's Nacogdoches, and Nacogdoches is a little farther east, a little farther west of Los Adias. They establish a mission in 1716, same year. 2 years later, the Spanish established what would become San Antonio. San Antonio would be a success for the most part. The only real serious success of a settlement within Spanish Texas. So 1718, San Antonio. The key is, though, how many of y'all grew up in Texas? So you had Texas history every year of your life, right? And so who do you know, who are the people, what population is usually given the credit for making San Antonio a success in the mid 1700s? Any idea? Some people brought in from the Canary Islands, Spaniards who had colonized the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, were plantation owners. They were intentionally brought into San Antonio mid 1700s in order to establish a viable agricultural colony and make the place work. And they did. They established a San Antonio, basically a San Antonio culture that was connected to the Canary Islanders. That's kind of a weird, but if you've ever seen the old John Wayne movie, The Alamo, right? You've seen that? Okay, you know I can't remember which character it was, but they had this big straw hat. I can't remember. If you look at, do a Google search for the Alamo, you'll see a plantation looking up. It's a Canary Islanders plantation garb. All right, so it's actually kind of a cool connection there. All right, well, anyway, there are other missions established in Texas between Los Adias going down the Gulf Coast basically toward Laredo. And those included Bahia and Goliad, and those would be some early outposts in Texas. But San Antonio is the most important. San Antonio is the most important colony within Texas by far. It was established as a civil community, and again, here are the Canary Islanders I was referring to revive the economy there. And by 1731, San Antonio was designated as the capital of Texas, okay, the provincial capital. And so the first capital of Texas was what? Los Adias, technically, which was actually in Louisiana today, okay? So the capital moves from Los Adias I think, to Nacogdoches, and then eventually San Antonio would hold in San Antonio for a while. Okay, so of course until the Texas Republic independence. So anyway, the Spanish population in Texas, however, even as late as 1821, the last year of Spanish holding of Texas, only about 4,000 to 5,000 people. So it's not a huge area. Of course, you've all seen the Alamo, right? The Alamo is what is it? Is it a presidio, or is it a mission, or is it what? Yeah, it was a mission. It's a mission. So, one of the more famous areas. In Texas, this is referred to as what? The Alamo. What's the formal name of it? Anybody know? You Texans all know. The Shrine of Texas Liberty, right? All right, anyway. They don't let Ozzy Osbourne back there, though, right? You even know who Ozzy Osbourne was? Okay. You know what he did? You know what he did to get kicked out of Texas? Yeah, he urinated on the Alamo, so he's banned from Texas, I guess. But not hard for me to believe, Okay. So, all right. So anyway, we've got some more slides of stuff and other forts and that sort of thing. In a very, very short time, I've already talked a little bit about California. California was the last area settled by the Spanish, and it was the most half-hearted effort of all because it was largely a matter of administrative things. There were some Californios, there were some Spaniards who colonized mostly Southern California, mostly ranchers, and their land rights were generally ignored after about 1850 when the California Gold Rush arrived. So very different in California. The Spanish were really not that successful, although some of the most significant locations were established by the Spanish. And the last thing, of course, what did the Spanish do of great significance in California that maybe is still today California is known for? The missions, yes, and the wine industry. They got the wine industry going because of the need for wine. So the California wine industry owes its heritage to the old Spanish mission. About time to go, so thanks for coming to class, and look out for the chords as you mosey on out of here.